Good morning, and thank you for coming to our ADA seminar. We're just going to give it a couple minutes so anybody who's getting on can get on before we get started. Hello and good morning again. My name is Katie Hunt Thomas. I am the Disability Rights Attorney and Director of Advocacy here at the Ability Center. I want to thank everyone who's here for coming to the Ability Center's 5th annual ADA seminar, which we put on with our partners, TMACOG and the Toledo-Lucas County Commission on Disabilities every year. This year, our theme is creating transit access from government to grassroots. For those who missed our first speaker, we're featuring 4 sessions that are discussing, best practices in public transit for people with disabilities as we approach our own chance to expand public transit in Northwest Ohio this November. We encourage anyone who's attending to check out our seminar website, which I'll put on the chat after this, and attend all remaining 3 sessions, and also join our ADA coordinator email list. This year, and anyone who attends all 4 of our sessions will be put into a drawing for a grab bag, which includes a Toledo is for Everyone t-shirt. Just a couple of small housekeeping matters. There is closed captions available. You just need to click on the live transcript button, which is in the bottom toolbar, and you'll be able to get closed captions. We encourage anyone who attends after this to also check out the Ability Center's ADA Coordinator Library, which has a lot of resources on transition planning and how to become compliant with the ADA. For this session, all questions are going to be left until the end. There's a Q&A box in the toolbox at the bottom, which is a place for folks to put questions as they go, and we'll address them at the end. At this point, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Vera Mendoza, who's our disability rights advocate in the areas of housing and transportation, to introduce this session and our speaker. So go ahead, Vera.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Ability Center's annual ADA seminar. I'm so excited to introduce to you activist Justice Shorter. I heard wonderful things about her sort of through the grapevine of what is disability justice activism, and for her to be here with us today is really exciting. I can read you a little bit about her, but you will be so excited to learn from her directly. Justice Shorter is a disability justice advocate and a Black Disabled Lives Matter amplifier. She's a national expert on disability inclusive disaster protection, emergency management, and humanitarian crises and conflicts. As a youth journalist in 2005, Justice began writing professionally on topics related to community development, humanitarian affairs, and youth empowerment. Driven to action by these issues, she has studied community development in South Africa, peace and post-conflict reconciliation in Uganda, Rwanda, periodically returned to her childhood community to teach on subjects surrounding social action and communication, and earned a bachelor's in journalism with minors in justice and peace studies from Marquette University. That's just a little bit about her. In more recent years, Justice served as a disability integration advisor with the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency, deploying frequently to disaster areas across America and its territories. To have her here in our little Northwest Ohio town in virtual gathering is very exciting. Without further ado, I present to you Justice Shorter.
Hi, Vera. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate such a warm introduction. And hello, everyone. It is a thrill to be in community and in conversation with you. Once again, my name is Justice Shorter. I want to alleviate any apprehensions or anxieties. You do not see me on the screen. There's nothing wrong with your computer or with the technology for today's session. I'm not on the screen because I am using multiple assistive devices and wanting to ensure that the interpretation marketers get pinned and that the captioning and everything shows up well on the screen. And given that I am not keeping my camera focused because I have multiple devices that I'm using, I typically opt to not be on screen. But if you need to see my face, because sometimes that is important for access purposes, please feel free to simply look me up online. There are multiple pictures and footage of me floating around these internets. And so if you need to place a face with the voice, by all means, please feel free to do so. A quick image description. I am a Black blind lesbian woman. I have my hair in flat twist in the front and 2-strand twist in the back. It is a natural hairstyle. I am currently presenting today from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So shout out to the Midwest where I was born and raised. I am out here for somber reasons in terms of some recent family losses, but it is always a joy to be surrounded by love and laughter and community. And so I'm also, as I mentioned before, quite excited to be in community, to extend that a bit and be in community with you all here today. As another measure of access, I have actually cut down on the number of slides that I use. Because I am using a screen reader, I am speaking and listening simultaneously to my notes and my material. So that means I sometimes speak at a quicker clip, but I have intentionally drawn down how many slides I have so that I won't be intrigued or kind of pushed into going a bit quicker to keep pacing and to be mindful of time. So I'm going to go a little bit slower today to enhance access as much as I can for everybody here. I came to this work because I typically am focused on emergency management issues, right? So that includes emergency evacuations and accessible modes of transportation during disasters and crises. And the coordinators of this event came to my work as a result of those issues and asked me to be present here today. So that is how the connection was made. However, I am hoping that much of this material can be applied. They asked me to adapt some of the things that I typically talk about around advocacy and activism and justice-based movements, and to hopefully encourage and motivate you all to continue the good fight, as the luminary Shirley Chisholm would say, in terms of the work that you all are doing out there in Northwest Ohio. So I'm really excited to talk to you all here today. So if you need anything, please let us know in terms of accommodations. And with that, we're going to ground a little bit. Next slide. All right, so I typically like to ground all of the presentations that I do and just asking participants to just do a little bit of thought work and acknowledge why we are here. There's a purpose to you being in this room. What is that for you, right? I could have a purpose for showing up here and it could be entirely different than the one that you come to today's conversation with. So what is the purpose of why you're here? Are you expressing a commitment to supporting those and centering those who are the most impacted by these issues? That, of course, being commuters or individuals with disabilities more largely, right? Or commuters with disabilities, and thinking about this in terms of transit systems and issues and restrictions and limitations that they have on the disability community. Examine where you enter. Do you come to this issue as someone with a disability, as a parent, as a colleague of individuals with disabilities, as an advocate, as an activist, but who are you and how do you come to these issues? Let's ground ourselves in that knowledge here today. Explore what you would like to do. I like to tell people that this is not a philosophical activity, but this is something that is more practical in nature. When we show up in these types of spaces, we come here to do something. We come here because we have goals and objectives, or we have dreams and aspirations. So what does that mean in terms of what you hope to do when you leave this room? We are in a pandemic, obviously, and we've been in a lot of Zoom rooms. But what do you do when you get out of them? Is the question. So throughout today's presentation, I encourage you to explore that today. Can you leave with a rumbling in your belly in terms of you wanting to get out there and change the course of action in terms of how things have been done so far, or to actually implement and enact things that you have been thinking of or pondering for quite some time? Or are you going to be encouraged to get together with some friends, some colleagues, some family members and say, we're going to do our bit? What does that look like for us? How can we shape this so that it is molded in something that is accessible and that is doable, something that's feasible for us in our community, right? Not something that's prescribed, but something that is more practical for our own personal and professional purposes. I have content warnings on here because later on in the presentation, I do mention how transportation is essential when dealing with sex trafficking and domestic violence. So that's just a content warning. There will be no detailed description of either of those issues. It's just important to let you know that that's coming. I encourage folks to create collective access. So sometimes if I mention something or a book, people often will create access for other folks in the room by putting those links directly into the chat box. So I encourage either the coordinators to help me that if participants can't do it, or participants, if you can, to throw that information into the chat box. Sometimes these Zoom rooms are set up differently for different meetings and sessions. I also just wanted to let you guys know that this presentation is not set in stone. I have done it many times, and we adapted, we adjusted based on the issue, based on the group, and the topic at hand, and what folks are hoping to get out of it. With that said, your feedback, your questions, your comments and contributions at the end will certainly help this presentation to evolve. The way that it is done today will certainly not be the way it's done tomorrow, or 2 weeks from now, or 3 weeks from now. So please do come with that understanding, and know that we typically do this related to crises and emergencies, but we've also expanded it to sex trafficking and domestic violence and trauma-informed care and a bunch of other issues, because folks have attended the workshop in some variation and have found it to be quite helpful and applicable to the work that they're doing in whatever realm. So I encourage you to do that as well. If it's helpful, if it's useful in the context of transportation, great. But if you can apply it in other ways and in other means in your life, by all means, feel free to do so. And let me know how it goes, because maybe we can adapt and adjust a little bit more. Next slide. All right, I just want to acknowledge the reason that I am here and the reason that I do this work. And I always like to start off with some lineages and guiding lights. So I just want to acknowledge a couple of folks here. And I do this also as a point of access, because I drop a lot of these names throughout presentations, and folks are always asking, how is it spelled? What was the name of that book? What was the name of that person that you mentioned? Who was the author? And so now I've just included it at the very beginning as a point of access, so that people do not have to worry about scurrying to get the information. Also, as a point of access, you guys will get copies of this slide deck. It's uploaded on the Summit's website or web pages, so you guys will have access to it if you don't already have it downloaded. But this is just a point of reference for you to go back to. So let me acknowledge some of these here verbally. I want to acknowledge Sins Invalid, the creators of disability justice, which I'll talk about in just a second. I want to give honor and just homage and thank yous to the 3 women of color with disabilities who started disability justice, and that's Patty Burns, Stacey Park Milburn, Mia Mingus. Of course, I want to always acknowledge them. And then a couple other folks here, Leroy Moore, Leah Lakshmi Peepsna Samra Sinha, who is actually the author of Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice. And that was a book that truly changed my life, not only in terms of the way I saw myself in this work, but just in terms of how I saw myself, period. Folks who are doing great work that's just widely applicable to a multitude of movements, such as critical resistance. Miriam Kaba, who is the author of We Do This Till We Free Us, a phenomenal book around transformative justice and abolition. Sick of It, a disability inside outside project that kind of pairs people with disabilities who are incarcerated with folks who have disabilities who are not incarcerated. And the reason why I have these listed is because the work here, they happen in different areas, right? I'm talking about things that are going on in transformative justice, and that's different than, you know, some of the things that are happening in other movements, but a lot of them are inextricably linked, and I'll talk about that later on. But you learn so much when you study the work and the ideas and the activities of folks who are doing this, who are doing great things in just different areas. And so I've learned so much from these groups. I always wanted to acknowledge them. Folks may say that's not specific to emergencies. I'd say that's okay, because an emergency can happen at any time, and it just exacerbates pre-existing problems and crises that folks are dealing with, right? I think about people like Aurora Levins Morales, who is the author of Medicine Stories, which is a wonderful and phenomenal read that teaches you so much about disability justice, kind of those grounding frames around how people with disabilities are treated and so viewed in this country. I think about Alice Wong, really everything Alice Wong touches. Stacey Haynes, who is the author of The Politics of Trauma. I will mention that book again later on. So I mentioned the book Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice. I mentioned Medicine Stories by Aurora Levins Morales. And I just mentioned Stacey Haynes, who is the author of The Politics of Trauma. And Alice Wong also has several books. So throughout today's presentation, you'll hear me repeating things and kind of going back again and saying things once again a little bit slower, again, as a point of access for everybody on the line. I think about folks like Adrienne Marie Brown, who is the author of several great books, Pleasure Activism being one, Emergent Strategy, and We Will Not Cancel Us, all of which are wonderful reads and contributes to this type of work in various ways. Sherry R. Arnstein, who created the Ladder of Citizen Participation, which I'll go through later on in today's presentation. Prentice Hemphill, who taught me one of the best lessons around boundaries. She didn't just teach me personally. It's not like Prentice even knows me, but, and let me correct, their pronouns are they, them. So they just have this wonderful podcast and it has taught me a lot. The podcast is called Finding Her Way. Such a great name. And so those are just a few of the folks. And again, you'll get copies of this, everybody. So no need to fret about writing everything down. Next slide. A special dedication. So when you talk about thinking about transportation, and I asked you guys to explore why you're doing this work, I thought about all of the different people who use public transportation in some way, shape, or form, whether it's paratransit or whether it's other forms of public transportation. And so I wanted to acknowledge them because some of you might be in the room. So I wanted to affirm you. And as we talk about these issues, we can't do so from an abstract perspective, right? We need to acknowledge the people in the room who this work is truly for, right? So just a quick shout out to parents with disabilities, houseless folks with disabilities, immigrants with disabilities, older adults, students with disabilities, care workers and caregivers with disabilities, LGBTQIA folks with disabilities, people with disabilities in jails and prisons, fat folks, mad people or individuals with psychiatric disabilities, deaf folks, and all those with disabilities who don't identify with the word disability or feel at home in the disability community. Next slide. All right, critical question. So when we started off doing these presentations, the one thing that I like to ask folks for is like, what are you mobilizing for? Because this presentation is all about talking about the grassroots ways of doing this work. And sometimes when I do these workshops, people ask me to just give them all of the answers. And that is not the purpose of this. The purpose is to help you come to your own conclusions. You live there. You are immersed in these issues every day. These problems directly affect you, your families, your clients. And so I tend to come to these issues with the thought or the anticipation of getting people to ask themselves certain questions so that we're not being prescriptive and we're not just being calculating, but we're actually being more strategic. We're actually being more present. So these are some of the questions that I encourage you to ask yourself in doing this work around transportation. What are we mobilizing for? Where are we going? Who gets to go in terms of transportation lines, in terms of mobility services across the state, in terms of paratransit and different options? Where do they go? Literally in terms of routes. Who gets to utilize those services? Who gets displaced? Is anybody displaced in terms of new transit lines or transportation services that might be in place in terms of like highways or rail services? These things differ across the country, right? So it's just, is there displacement happening there? Who gets left behind? How are we getting there as a community? What gets destroyed or created in the process? When do we move and when do we mobilize? Why does it matter? And then who gets to decide the metrics of success, right? When it comes to folks with disabilities, sometimes we have outside entities determining for us what is successful or what success looks like. And the goal here is to determine who gets to tell us what success is. Is it us or is it someone else, right? Is it the individuals within your community or is it some outside group saying, well, this is enough and you should be happy with that, right? Or are you determining for yourselves, no, that's actually not enough and we deserve and we have earned and we are worthy of so much more. And so we're going to keep mobilizing, we're going to keep organizing, we're going to keep being activated until we get what we have come here for. Next slide. All right, so I mentioned disability justice, and disability justice is really the framework that really fuels a lot of the work that I do. And I hope that it'll fuel the activism and the mobilization that you guys are doing as well. Disability justice is a framework that was coined by a group of queer disabled women of color that were connected through Sins Invalid, a US-based performance project that incubates and celebrates artists with disabilities, centralizing artists that are of color, queer, and gender variance as well. As communities who have been historically marginalized, disability justice recognizes the complexity of multiple marginalized individuals and groups and aims to be more holistic in recognizing and involving these complexities. And so Sins Invalid has created 10 principles of disability justice. And if you have not already gone to their website or checked them out, you can find them at sinsinvalid.org or .com. I always forget this. So if someone can throw that into the chat for access purposes, that would be great, because I always tell people to refer back to the source here. If you want more information. And they have an entire primer on disability justice called Skin, Tooth, Bone, a disability justice primer. But I really use this as the foundational pieces of the rest of today's presentation as we talk about some of those principles that I mentioned before, and then also how that can be applied to the activism and the mobilization work that you guys are doing. Next slide. All right, so as I mentioned, there are 10 principles of disability justice. I will not get into all of them just because we don't have a tremendous amount of time here today, but I wanted to acknowledge a few here in hopes that just the understanding of it or the exposure to it will help encourage you in the type of work that you do. So the first is intersectionality. And I always like to acknowledge and distinguish the difference here between intersectionality and diversity. People like to use them interchangeably, and they are not the same thing. Diversity focuses on difference and celebrates difference, whereas intersectionality really kind of gets down to the nuts and bolts of dealing with compounded forms of discrimination and oppression. And what does that mean for historically marginalized populations, right? So if we're talking about transportation and we're looking at this from an intersectional lens, are we thinking about this in terms of people with disabilities, one marginalized group, as well as people of color with disabilities? And so those are two different forms of dealing with compounded forms of discrimination or prejudicial treatment. And then let's talk about this from a gender perspective. So let's talk about trans folks of color with disabilities, or women of color with disabilities, cisgender women of color with disabilities, right? So can we think about how all of those different identities have impacted a person's ability to access transportation systems in various ways throughout your community? Do they face discrimination as soon as they enter? Are they being questioned and queried with regards to identifications cards, which can sometimes be difficult for folks who are transgender, showing that proof of documentation in such a way, or being required to do that for various things and not having identification that matches their gender expressions. And so these are different things to just be mindful of. If we're talking about intersectionality as it relates to transportation, it's not just diversity. We're not just talking about that. We're not just acknowledging that we all have different experiences, but we're talking about what are the impacts of those experiences as it pertains to discrimination and prejudicial treatment and biases. One of the other ones here is leadership by the most impacted. So who are the people who are most impacted by transportation shortages or restrictions or limitations or shifts, right? And are those the folks who are leading our movements, or are they, the leadership coming from people who don't even live in those communities, right? Who aren't even impacted by public transportation concerns? We want to make sure that the people who are the most impacted are at the center of all conversations, but then also leading all conversations. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we talk about the ladder of citizen participation later on. Anti-capitalist politics, this sometimes scares people, but the essential point to focus on here is that people have worth outside of their ability to produce things, right? So if we're talking about transportation, are we framing our arguments? Are we framing our messaging only around workers with disabilities, right? So attaching our value only to our ability to work and be employees? Or are we saying people with disabilities just deserve transportation because we deserve transportation? That is in and of itself a good enough reason, right? People deserve to go to the grocery store, but they also deserve to go to festivals. We also deserve to go to nightclubs and have a social life. We also deserve to go visit our families and our loved ones and our spouses if they are in different locations. We deserve to drop our kids off at school and go back and pick them up. We deserve access in a multitude of ways, right? Not just getting back and forth to work, to the grocery store, to the pharmacy, and that is it. That is the extent of your life as a disabled person, and that's all you deserve. If it's not connected to your productivity in terms of your job or in terms of some other what is deemed a productive activity, then you don't deserve access to for any other leisure purpose, right? or just the purpose to contribute to your overall well-being. For me, you can't keep me from my family. If you do, I am not well. I am not okay. I am going to be enduring all types of hardships, right? So that matters to me just as much as getting back and forth to my job does, right? So we want to think about that if we're talking about how we're framing our messaging. Are we only focused on commuters who have jobs, or the ability to get to a employment hub? So, for example, if there's multiple jobs in a commercial area, are we only framing our conversations around that, or are we talking about the fact that people with disabilities deserve access in any number of ways? I'm going to keep going here, and I'm going to just kind of gloss over some of these. Commitment to cross-movement organizing. Again, that's understanding that people with disabilities have multiple identities. So we're not just in our advocacy and our activism only reaching out to disability groups. Are we also reaching out to racial justice groups? Are we also reaching out to LGBTQIA groups? Are we also reaching out to various religious groups? Because people with disabilities are in all of those categories as well. So how are we engaging them as we organize for change? We want to recognize wholeness, because we all, as I mentioned before, have inherent worth, and have value and contributions in just any number of ways. And so are we recognizing the wholeness of an individual? Yes, you have a disability, but you might also be a mom and a caregiver. You might also be a part of a network of other folks with disabilities helping to care for one another and need transportation for those purposes. But there is a wholeness to who you are, and you are not just your disability. So what does that mean in terms of how you quite literally move through your city and through your areas, right? So that's important to acknowledge. We want to think about this in terms of sustainability. Are we thinking of solutions that will only be implemented for the next 2 years, or does it have long-term implications, right? Are we taking a win that may get us through the next 6 months, but we will have to endure all of this organizing and all of the concerns yet again in a year from now or 2 years from now? Or are we investing in a strategy that might not even be implemented until 5 years from now? And if so, what does that mean for the period of time up until that 5-year mark when the project is finished, right? So just what does that mean in terms of your transportation strategies, or your strategies around transportation and access for people with disabilities as it relates to timing and sustainability? We want to think about this in terms of cross-disability solidarity. Are our conversations around transportation only focused on people with mobility disabilities, or are we thinking about this in terms of people with the different developmental disabilities or intellectual disabilities, people who are blind, people who are deaf, people who have autism, just all types of disabilities, right? So let's incorporate that into our conversation, into our messaging, into our outreach, into our partnerships. Understanding interdependence, and again, that's that we all need each other to survive. And it's really important. Collective access, I talked about earlier a little bit, and collective liberation. None of us are free until we are all free. And the late great Toni Morrison said that the function of freedom is to free somebody else. So if you have transportation in your area, or if you guys get this win in your particular region of the state, how do we then blanket and replicate that strategy in other parts of the state to make sure we also have the capacity to help free other folks with disabilities, quite literally, and getting to wherever places they need to be or just desire to be, as I mentioned before, also rather important. Next slide. All right, so transportation justice requires disability justice. I'm not going to stay on this a ton of time, but again, acknowledging that these words are sometimes used interchangeably, disability justice and disability rights, and they are not the same thing. Disability justice kind of picks up where disability rights leaves off. There's collective trauma and harm to marginalized communities and current transportation practices that must be addressed at systemic levels. Multiple tools and tactics are needed to help communities survive and thrive. Justice is not always achieved via legal and legislative means, and not everyone has equal access to legal supports, and that's important to know. Disability rights tends to focus on dismantling systemic discrimination, right, for people with disabilities, whereas disability justice tends to focus on how we can build and bridge beyond those systems. So again, it picks up, disability rights is the foundational piece, and disability justice tends to pick up and build and bridge beyond what is currently in place in terms of legal and legislative actions, and understand that not all people with disabilities can have the luxury or the privilege of being able to withstand a protracted legal process, right? That the timing of that, things might be a bit more critical in terms of a solution needs to be forthcoming way sooner, and they may not have years to wait, right? So sometimes legal and legislative means may not be the best course of action. Maybe there needs to be a different strategy, different kind of grassroots efforts, different mutual aids, different media messages, but just different forms of moving the needle to bring forth some sort of progress and some level of relief for people who are currently dealing with the real brunt of the problem. Again, we're centering people who are the most impacted in that conversation. Next slide. Structural violence. I wanted to bring this up, and I will explain here in just a moment, but let me read this definition for accessibility purposes. So structural violence refers to any scenario in which a social structure perpetuates inequities and causes preventable harm, injury, and or death. It examines how economic, political, medical, and legal systems can have a disproportionately negative impact on marginalized groups and communities. These systems are misleadingly thought of as normal or natural, rather than harmful processes and forces that actively constrain individual agency. Lastly, it reveals the barriers that create differences between a group's or person's potential reality and their actual conditions. So what does this mean? Well, we have the tools, the tactics, and the technologies to assure equitable access to transportation. So the potential is present, right? We have the potential for people with disabilities to have access to transportation services. And yet, when it comes to our actual lived conditions, it is a far cry for people with disabilities to have efficient, affordable, reliable, and accessible transportation options. And this is the case all over the country, especially as we start thinking about communities of color and more rural neighborhoods as well, right? Where often the transit lines stop or don't even reach them to begin with. Right. So it's not as if we don't know what we know what buses are, we know what light rail services are, we know what metro systems are, we know what trolley systems are. We have the technology or the tools, devices, we know what those things are. They're already in existence. No one has to dream them up. Their potential is there. But when it comes to the actual lived conditions, the actual conditions that we live with on a day-to-day basis, those resources are not readily available to individuals with disabilities, especially in a manner that is efficient and affordable and reliable and accessible. And I cannot mention this enough, because sometimes cities will say, well, we have a paratransit service, and so many people with disabilities opt out of it because they do not have 5 or 4 hours to be in transit. And when I say that, I mean the time that you spend waiting to get on paratransit for them to pick you up, the time that it takes sometimes to drive around and get other people dropped off, the time it takes you to just go in and run and probably get something done and then get back on paratransit and wait for them to come back and pick you up, and then maybe ride back around to drop other people off and then get you back home. And so you hear all types of stories. I'm sure I don't have to tell you all this. As being people with disabilities, hopefully many of you are, you know what I'm speaking of. If you've been in tune with this conversation, whether it be in your area or in different parts of the country, I'm not sure how applicable it is in your area, but it is certainly a concern in other areas as well. Next slide. So I wanted to acknowledge, when we talked about the fact that, some harms can be caused for individuals with disabilities, when we talk about structural violence. And again, that is the active decisions to deny, right? So to deny someone their potential reality and to make them live in actual conditions that are far beneath, far distance and separate from what they could be living, the reality that they could have, right? So there's something that is structurally violent about that. So in understanding that, I would also just want to mention something quickly here about trauma. One of the most concise and beautiful definitions that I have heard comes to us by way of Stacey Haynes, who has a book called The Politics of Trauma. And she simply describes trauma as an experience, a series of experiences or the impact of social conditions that break or betray our inherent need for safety, dignity, and belonging. You say that we belong to a community, and yet everybody else has access to transportation and you deny us. You say that you want us to be safe, and yet you cut off transportation services at a certain time for people with disabilities when others have access far longer. And again, I'm talking more generally in terms of different issues that you might encounter across the nation. You say that you care about people with disabilities, and yet the way we are spoken to when we get on paratransit options, or the way that we are spoken to or interacted with when we use public transportation, is a way that hits at our need to have dignity, right? So that it is an undignified way of how people treat us sometimes, from bus drivers not wanting to lower the lifts, from individuals not wanting to get out of the seating that is specifically reserved for folks with disabilities, and no one being there to enforce that. From individuals with disabilities being dismissed when they call for help or call to re-register for appointments in order to book trips, and so on and so forth. How do people treat you in terms of the operators, everyone from the operators who take the calls if you're trying to register for a trip, to the actual drivers of buses and trains and trolleys and any other form of transportation that you might have present in your area, right? So it's just important to think about that in terms of how traumatizing that can be. I want to affirm that experience for anybody on the line who has kind of dealt with the residual impact of feeling as if you did not have safety, you did not have belonging, and that your dignity had been compromised, or people tried to demean your dignity at various points when you were simply trying to get from point A to point B and living your life. I want to acknowledge and affirm that experience for you if you've had it, because I've had it, and many of us who live in this life as individuals with disabilities have had it. Next slide. So some additional causes of harm as it relates to transportation systems. We just want to acknowledge some of these issues and hope that you, if you're not already incorporating this into your advocacy and your ability to mobilize, you might want to do so, because in doing this, you might be able to tune into multiple groups who are working on these issues in different ways. So we want to think about this in terms of barriers to transportation that are caused by biases related to class, race, gender, disability, sexuality, age, housing, etc. So what are those barriers? What are those biases? And can we connect with some of those communities that it's also impacting and say, hey, I know you got people with disabilities in these communities. Let's team up, let's partner. Transportation systems and new transit technologies without transparency, that can be a cause of harm, right? So how those technologies are set up, how those transportation systems are set up, and if they don't have transparency embedded, that can cause harm to communities. We're thinking about this in terms of policing and prison, probation, and surveillance, particularly around who gets surveilled, criminalized, penalized, institutionalized, scapegoated, and policed during interactions with transportation systems, right? So your inability to pay tickets, or your inability to just simply pay on public transportation system. How often are those activities criminalized? How often are you penalized? How often does it just put you in contact with carceral systems, right? If you have a mental health episode or event on a public transportation system, is the first option to call the police, and does that then lead you to be institutionalized for weeks and weeks on end, or months or years for some individuals as well, right? So anyone on the line who may have mental health consideration and has noticed this as an issue, these are some things to just simply think about, right? And also, what does that mean in terms of lack of access to available transit services? So again, these are many people with disabilities who are unable to make probation hearings or meetings with probation officers because they don't have access to transportation. And again, re-imprisoned or re-incarcerated because of those issues, right? So we're just trying to look at this from multiple perspectives as we think about people with disabilities, and a large number of those in jails and prison are individuals with disabilities of some kind, or some sort of access, functional need, or mental health consideration. So we're talking about collective liberation. We're talking about all of us folks. So what does that mean? We're also looking at this in terms of other harms, gaslighting that could be caused from government representatives, case managers, voluntary organizations, sex or labor trafficking, as well as domestic violence and gender-based violence. So I mentioned this earlier when I gave the content warning. What I simply mean by this is that these different problems, sex trafficking or domestic violence and gender-based violence, those things can be exacerbated. They can be made far worse when people don't have the transportation options to flee or to get away from those troubles or those problems, right? So if you're asking people to leave a harmful condition or a harmful environment, and yet they don't have any means of doing it, that is a problem, right? So we want to think about that in terms of transportation and keeping people safe, or they don't have a means of moving around the city or around the region. So let's say you move a family to a shelter option, but that shelter is 5 miles away from her home, or away from her job rather. What does she do if she doesn't have access to transportation and she still needs to work in order to keep her kids, and in order to get a home, in order to get out of the shelter setting? So what does that mom with a disability do with her children? And does that impact her decision to stay in an abusive home because it's closer to her job, and maybe she thinks that she can just endure until she has enough money saved up to potentially get out? But of course, that runs the risk of what could happen in that time, of that period of time of waiting and trying to transition out, right? So if we're talking about transportation option, let's think about that in terms of domestic violence and gender-based violence, and giving people the option to still move around the city to do the things that they need to do. Also, still having access to support systems that may live in those neighborhoods, right? So you may move somebody farther out and they may be able to access a shelter someplace, but their support systems, the people who watch their kids or their kids' school, is all the way across town, or maybe even in another county. What does that mean in terms of transportation? And does that then impact their decision to leave in the first place? Economic exploitation, abuse, and exploitation by individual or organizations providing resource assistance or skills training or advocacy, exclusion or erasure in transportation services, intentional divestment in sustainable transportation infrastructure within communities of color, as well as rural areas. All of these things can cause harm, right? So these are just a few causes of harm, as well as the reliable two causes of harm, which are ableism and racism, to be sure. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to quickly go through this ladder of citizen participation, because a lot of people, I will use this quite often, and people will kind of print this out and they'll use it in the different types of work that they do, because it's just a good reference point if you're talking about making sure that people with disabilities are at the center. If you are a person with a disability or a group that represents people with disabilities, what does this mean in terms of how you organize and how you do outreach? So one is manipulation. This is having one thing in mind, but you're really just trying to get people with disabilities to just get to your goal, get to your objective, and it's not really engaging with any real intention to bring their ideas, their contributions to the forefront. You have a plan in mind, you know what you want to do, and you're just trying to get them to get on board. So you will do or say whatever needs to be done in order to get that to happen, or people will do or say whatever needs to be done to you, your folks with disabilities, to just get you on board with their agenda. Two is therapy. So this is kind of putting forth a solution that gets at the symptoms and not the actual problem itself. So for example, that is, well, listen, we know that you all have dealt with a lot of problems in your community. And so instead of dealing with those problems, we're going to kind of put a Band-Aid on it. And I typically give the example of what happens in communities who are facing environmental racism or environmental degradation, and that sometimes a clinic is just provided, but it's still a toxic waste dump. You know? So there's still a problem here. We still have an issue. Or you may provide public transportation, and those buses still, you know, or those options still not be fully accessible for individuals with disabilities, right? So thinking about that as well. Three is informing. Again, that's simply knowing what you want and then just informing the community of what's going to happen. You don't have a particular you're not necessarily manipulating them as you would be on some of those lower rungs, but you are just going to tell them what's happening. So I'm just going to inform you. I'm going to give you the courtesy of letting you know. Number four is consultation. So that's bringing people into the conversation. So we don't call us, we'll call you. We'll let you know when we want to hear from you. Five is placation. So I typically say this happens when you piss some people off and there's a brief window of time that opens up, and it allows a community to be assuaged a little bit. So a big problem has happened and now we need to placate the community because they're upset. They maybe have written op-eds or something has happened. They have a big media blitz or campaign. The community is really riled up. Folks are protesting. And in order to calm this down, we have to do something. So we're going to give them something, but this is a problem because it's typically not sustainable. And so sometimes the solutions, it's going to be a window to get a solution in and have it last long term. Or the other side of that coin is it could be something that is just the simple option to address the issue, just but temporarily so, right? 6 is partnership. So this is trying to come in and really bring people to the table. But again, not all partnerships are made equal. So sometimes it could be a partnership that's 70-30 in terms of decision-making authority and power over an initiative. 7 is delegated power. So this means that you are telling a group of individuals, okay, we'll let you control, these decisions related to transportation options, but we'll tell you what decisions you can control or what groups you guys can be on, what committees, what panel, but we'll give you some delegated power. And then the last one is citizen control. And that's pretty self-explanatory in terms of the people having as much control as possible of what is happening with their transportation. And I love using this because it's applied in just multiple movements. And this was created back in 1969, and it is still applicable today. Next slide. All right, so as I mentioned before, I'm just going to reiterate and acknowledge things. I'm going to kind of repeat them. So I have a slide here that's just kind of going back and referencing some of the things that we've already mentioned thus far. The difference between a problem and a crisis is time. I learned that when I first started having courses around activities in daily living as someone with a disability. And so it's a problem if you don't have access to transportation. If you can still get to where you want to go, it just takes you longer, but it becomes a crisis when you actually need to get somewhere, or you might lose your job or your kids because you don't have access. The difference between slow and sudden emergencies is time. And again, it just talks about structural violence and what it exposes, right? The difference between people's potential reality and actual circumstances. We talked about that already. And then also this slide just kind of acknowledges that, much of the causes or the harms and some of the barriers caused by a lack of access to transportation, this causes issues for people long-term, and they're directly related to structural issues that we talked about before, right? And the lack of decision-making power presented for individuals with disabilities to have, right? So these are just all things to keep in mind as we're doing the type of activism that we need to do in order to utilize our experiences, our stories, our hopes, our dreams, our aspirations to actually get things done. Next slide. So this is a very simple slide, but if we're talking about the trajectory of transformation, we just want to think about this in terms of the historical or the generational. What are things that we have been dealing with for decades, right? We want to acknowledge our history in order to understand our present and to dream bigger and better and brighter for our future. We're thinking about this in terms of structural, which we talked about, interpersonal, which we talked about a little bit as well. Internal, in terms of some of that trauma, we talked about that as well. And then hopeful / world building, right? So what are we hoping for? So again, we go all the way from the historical to the hopeful as well, right? So thinking about transformation in terms of all of these different levels. Next slide. So this is also a very simple slide, but it's just simply acknowledging that all of these justice-based movements are inextricably linked. You can't talk about racial justice without talking about disability justice. You can't talk about transportation justice without talking about disability justice. You can't leave people with disabilities out of this conversation around any sort of changes or movements around transportation. We need to be a part of that discussion, right? And you can't talk about educational justice without disability justice. You can't talk about transformative justice without disability justice. So again, it's just, if we're having these conversations about different movements and you're trying to get different people a part of your team, just to make sure that they think about the fact that people with disabilities have to be a part of the conversation. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here with these last couple of slides. And just acknowledge and kind of read some of these things off. We want to acknowledge and hire people with disabilities in decision-making positions, right? We want to remember that representation doesn't always equal power, though, and that comes to us by way of Rashad Robinson of Color for Change. So sometimes you'll have people with disabilities in various positions or on committees, but then when you look at the policies, you look at the practices of an organization or of a department or government entity, it still has no real applications or uses related to folks with disabilities, right? So sometimes people will be placed in different positions, but it's not reflected in the programs and the processes. Sometimes there needs to be acknowledgement and apology and accountability for harms that have been caused. So what does that mean in terms of transportation systems and your communities as well? What is being negotiated, compromised, changed, and sustained? We talked about that a little bit earlier. We want meaningful change, and understand that policy change without programmatic and practical and behavioral change is not equity, but rather an empty promise. And a policy or apology without change is manipulation. And that's Rachel Ricketts. I love that quote. it's just so simple, but apology without change is manipulation. I absolutely love it. And we talked about that earlier, right? When we referenced the letter of citizen participation. Next slide. All right, this is the last slide before my contact information. So these are just a couple of other things for you guys to think about. We've talked about all of this already, but we need new builders, right? We need new people coming to the table, folks like yourself, to talk about transportation and to be leaders in that space, and to make sure that we're also making and bringing forth new bridges. What does that mean in terms of resource allocation and mutual aid, again, to fill in the gaps? And what does that look like across communities of color and in rural areas? We want to think about intersectional interventions, right? We want to think about new transportation technologies, but also making sure that they don't secretly track or surveil communities of color. The people with disabilities are in those communities. So it's important to think about that because it causes a lack of trust in transportation options and technologies that are newly coming out and being created. And who creates, can we create new metrics of success? And how are we thinking about safety and mobility and what ways that are reimagined? And can we redefine resilience, right? Sometimes they'll say, well, that community is very resilient. They've been managing without transportation for so long. They will kind of put the onus on the individual, and as opposed to looking at transportation as a social and environmental issue as well, right? So let's make sure we're thinking about that. And then we also want investments in inclusive and critical transportation infrastructure throughout communities of color as well, in rural areas, in areas of your city or your region that have yet to be touched. And we want to think about the daily dismantling of structural, interpersonal, and internal violence, which we talked about a lot as well, right? And then lastly, we also just want to reject any attempts to invalidate solutions that come from our communities, right? Sometimes if we don't get it perfect during a pilot or during the rollout, folks like to dismiss us and say that what we bring is not useful or we don't know what we're doing. But we want to dismiss any attempts at that, because a lot of times we are doing our level best with absolutely nothing or very little to begin with. And yet and still we manage to produce wonderful results, or results that can be built upon, or changed and reformatted and redefined and reimagined to bring forth even more beautifully blossoming and blooming things in the future, right? So it's just important not to become discouraged if we don't get it right the first couple of times, right? We'll keep trying because we deserve at least that much, right? To give ourselves the things that people have refused us. Next slide. Lastly, once again, folks, my name is Justice Shorter. It's been a pleasure to be in conversation with you. If we do not have time for questions, you can certainly connect with me on Twitter. I'm at Justice Shorter 1. But I do want to stop here and open it up. I think we have a few minutes here. If there are any questions, I would love to take them. Thank you so much. And Vera, I'm going to toss it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Justice. Woo! Taking a deep breath after all the knowledge and wisdom you just shared with us. A lot of it clearly from lived experience, and a lot of it clearly from just the depth of research that you've done. I want to share one comment that was posted from Dr. Andy Fitzpatrick. She says, thank you for such a powerful presentation. Can you talk to us about coalition building and what it looks like for justice movement to be in partnership with movement organizations that are more neoliberal or moderate?
Mm. So one of the things that really stands out to me is are people coming together around a particular project, a particular campaign, a particular issue. Look, our politics may differ, and that's okay. The point of it all is to figure out what is the core issue that all of us can come together around. So if it is around equitable access to transportation, and if we have people of color with disabilities, racial justice groups need to be a part of this conversation. They need to be supporting this work and contributing to this work. What does that look like also if we have LGBTQIA folks with disabilities who are impacted by this issue? Where are all of my LGBTQIA organizations at on this issue? Where are they? Because people with disabilities live in those communities as well. So that's what I meant before when we talked about cross-movement organizing. That's one of those principles of disability justice, right? So that is all about coalition building and partnerships. But how are we reaching out to those groups, and do those groups actually see that they have a stake in this issue, right? Or have they simply kind of bypassed and said, oh, that's just a disability issue? No, it's not. It's your issue too, because I can guarantee you that there are people with disabilities in your community. So how are you showing up for them, right? So sometimes as people with disabilities, we're asked to put our issues to the side when we come into racial justice spaces, or when we come into LGBTQIA spaces, or when we come into religious spaces, or even sometimes when we come into educational spaces, right? So that needs to be shifted and changed. And so that's a major part of coalition building. What is the issue that we're focused on? Which communities are impacted, and who can we bring to the table who are actually going to contribute rather than detract from our goals and our objectives? And who's defining what our goals and objectives are? Again, back to one of those disability justice principles, are we centering those who are the most impacted in the leadership of those most impacted in these conversations? Because that's a huge part of coalition building as well. Sometimes groups will not come to the table because they don't see members of their groups reflected and represented, especially in leadership positions and deciding what the trajectory of a campaign is. So how can we make that happen as well? I'm going to pause there because I know we may need to get to other questions or comments, and but please, if there's additional follow-up, or you just want to chat and jam on this topic, I can do it all day. Please just connect with me directly.
I did share your contact information in the chat. Awesome. For anybody that just wants to copy and paste, please do so. Although we will also share this PowerPoint, and we will share a recording of this presentation today. We are at the 10-minute mark, past 12. We're scheduled until 12:15. So any last questions or thoughts are welcome. However, Justice has made herself available for you to reach out directly. I'd love to take this time as well to thank our interpreter team, Desiree and David. I know that you see them as ASL interpreter at the bottom. They are wonderful. I wanted to share their names with you. They are doing this work everywhere throughout Toledo. I see them all the time, and especially giving Desiree a shout out for doing work at Toledo Pride with the Turpin team. And thank you, Justice, for also being so candid about the LGBTQ community from a fellow member of the community.
Absolutely. I want to thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure to be in conversation. And again, I'm always available to continue chatting. And just as a point of access, I try to make myself available, because sometimes people, it's not accessible, or it's anxiety inducing to present questions in this format or in the Q&A. And so people like to just connect with you more directly, and that's okay. We'll find some time, we'll get on the calendar, we'll chat, we'll converse, but let me know. It's been a joy.
Thank you, Justice. As a reminder for everyone here, we do have 2 more sessions this afternoon. The next one will include local activists. It's a panel. You don't want to miss their conversation. I'm really excited for that. And if you know of anybody that should be here, that should be hearing this information, feel free to share their registration link. They are still able to participate in the remaining sessions. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Enjoy your lunch break.
Everybody.